I know you. You're that jaywalking punk anarchist.
Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer taking a look at Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, Penguin Books Publishing, 1957. In this book, Ayn Rand basically divides all of humanity into three categories: the prime movers, the looters, and the parasites, which are just like the average people. This story is about how the looters, who are bureaucratic, socially minded, liberal do-gooders, are destroying the economy and the world with their excessive regulations and taxes and government intervention in the market and welfare programs and the like. And so the prime movers, the stoic, individualistic entrepreneurs, must go on strike, must withhold their ingenuity and go into hiding in a secret Wakanda-style hidden capitalist utopia to wait for all the looters and the parasitic welfare bums that they support to all die off so that the prime movers can come out of hiding and create a free market capitalist utopia. In the book, the prime movers are like somehow solely responsible for everything to do with their companies. It's like Ayn Rand thinks that Steve Jobs was solely responsible for everything to do with Apple, or Bill Gates solely responsible for Microsoft. Same goes for Elon Musk and Tesla, Phil Knight and Nike, Jeff Bezos and Amazon, you name it. However, we know this isn't true. The engineers and scientists, often working with the government or with research and development grants, as well as the entry-level workers and everyone in between, all collectively made those companies what they are today. Also, this looters category seems to imply that any and all government taxes and regulations and social services are all just reckless meddling that only damage the market. Again, this is historically patently false. Many folks have been able to achieve great things, even things I'm sure Ayn Rand would support, by accessing low-income housing, welfare, food assistance, federal student aid, and other social services. Basically, these categories don't seem to correspond with reality. Regardless, thinking about these categories, I wanted to replace the prime movers and looters terminology Ayn Rand uses with something a little more accurate. At first I thought maybe use funny replacements like refer to Tony Stark or Scrooge McDuck or Bruce Wayne, particularly the Frank Miller one, or maybe even Mr. A or Rorschach, even if those are a little on the nose. But for our purposes here, I will be calling the prime movers utopian capitalists, and I will call the looters dystopian bleeding hearts. These terms are much more accurate, as you will see. Oh, and also, while reading this book, I noticed that a lot of its arguments are incredibly fascist. We'll see this explored throughout the overview of the text, but for good measure, in the conclusion of this video, I will look at one of the most well-regarded definitions of fascism, that being Umberto Eco's 14 Common Features of Fascism, and seeing how Atlas Shrugged stacks up. But anyway, with all that said, let's get into the text in depth. Oh, and if you didn't already know, this text is a bit of a beast. I'm going to try and go through it as expediently as possible, but there's no avoiding this being a long one. So get yourself a snack, get yourself comfortable, and let's get into it. Part 1. Non-contradiction. Oh yeah, the section of this book are named after the 3 fundamental laws of logic, because basically, like Ben Shapiro, Ayn Rand has a major hard-on for the aesthetics of logic and rationality, while demonstrating in practice that she actually doesn't understand it at all. It's great. Anyway, let's get into it. To start, we're introduced to Jim Taggart, a dystopian bleeding heart and president of the Taggart Transcontinental Train Company. And we meet our main protagonist, Jim's sister, the utopian capitalist, Dagny Taggart. Dagny does all the work, but Jim gets all the credit because he's the company president and because he has connections to politicians in Washington. Jim talks about how loyalty is important, even when it means working with companies who never deliver on time and always overcharge. And Dagny says, "Psh, forget that. I didn't order steel from our friends. I ordered Rearden metal, this new type of unobtainium adamantium fantasy metal that is stronger, cheaper, and lighter than steel." We then hear a little bit about this Hank Rearden, the utopian capitalist who invented this unobtainium type metal. Basically, he got his start working the worst jobs in the bottom of the mines, where everyone else was an idiot except for him, but eventually he worked his way up, pulled on those bootstraps, and now he's a genius entrepreneur, well, utopian capitalist. Your standard rags to riches fantasy fare that pro-capitalists like to wheel out. X person was a college dropout, but now they're a billionaire. X person got hired as the janitor, and now they're the CEO. You know the stories, always neglecting to mention the part where wealthy families, prestigious universities, loans, grants, and other connections made those stories possible. Oh, and like how Dagny Taggart has a dystopian bleeding heart brother opposite her character, well, Hank has a dystopian bleeding heart socialite gold digger wife, a college-educated philanthropist, never worked a day in his life brother, and his old crow of a mother, who all live with and off of Hank Reardon. We then hear about this guy Francisco d'Anconia, the richest man in the world who owns a bunch of copper mines. He is a childhood friend of Jim and Dagny Taggart. As a child, Francisco would run away from home to go and work in the factories because even from birth, he was just such a bootstrap lifting hard worker who was a super genius and always good at anything he ever tried. You'll see that this is a repeated pattern for the utopian capitalist types. Later, there's talk about government investment in Mexico and lifting up other nations, and Dagny has this internal monologue like, "My family is so cool, they didn't believe in getting any handouts from the government. My utopian capitalist grandpappy Nat Taggart, who created Taggart Transcontinental, went door to door to poor farmers getting investors, and when he was offered a government loan, he refused and threw that man down a flight of stairs." Dagny then walks the city wishing for some utopian capitalist man to come and sweep her off her feet. And she thinks about her favorite composer, another utopian capitalist who has disappeared. And she thinks about how quite a lot of these utopian capitalist folks have been disappearing lately. We then find out Mexico did nationalize their railways, and in response, the dystopian bleeding heart bureaucrats at the Rail Alliance passed the dog-eat-dog proposal to help protect the rails from over-competition. Talking to Hank, Dagny states, "I know it's useless getting angry at people like Jim and his friends. We haven't any time for it. First, I have to undo what they've done. Then afterwards they won't matter." And Hank replies, "All this lunacy is temporary. It can't last. It's demented, so it has to defeat itself." And Hank and Dagny talk about how they hate the dog-eat-dog proposal and how they're going to work together to build a railroad like no one has ever thought possible. By the way, it's important to keep in mind that the utopian capitalists throughout this whole book always talk and act like they're totally stoic, rational, logical, totally in control, unfazed, stoic people all the time. So keep that in mind going forward. We then find out that Dagny and Francisco used to hook up in college, but the last decade or so, he's been acting kind of like a Bruce Wayne playboy buffoon, which is out of character for him. He explains to Dagny that he has plans to bankrupt his mines in Mexico as a way of attacking the dystopian bleeding hearts. And Dagny's all like, "What? We're supposed to be utopian capitalists, bro. We're practically genetically designed to make companies, not destroy them. Why would you do the opposite of what we're practically designed to do?" Then, an equalization of opportunity bill is passed, and the dystopian bleeding hearts justify it, stating, "A free economy cannot exist without competition. Therefore, men must be forced to compete. Therefore, we must control men in order to force them to be free." Basically, every new bill or act or policy passed over the course of the story is a slow ramping up of overregulation, a slow government takeover of, and therefore destruction of, the economy. Hank has a wedding anniversary party, and everyone's there. Jim Taggart and Francisco and Hank talk about the equalization of opportunity bill and Mexico nationalizing its railways and all that. And Hank and Francisco talk about how they are total titans and supporting all these lazy parasites. But they bicker with each other about what it means to be a titan. Hank is all like, "Francisco, I have deduced rationally that I am the true titan and you are the parasite because you are ruining your investments in Mexico and acting like a total playboy buffoon." And Francisco's all like, "Quite the contrary, hanky-panky. The rational objective truth is that I am the real titan because I am super selfish and don't care about anyone but myself. Meanwhile, you are the parasite because you let your lazy good-for-nothing mother and brother and wife live off your hard work." Meanwhile, Dagny is breaking all of the new laws and regulations in order to get her rail built. She orders all her rails and replacement tools out of Reardon metal, which is of course cheaper than anyone else and always delivered on time. They also need to replace a bridge, and not only does Hank produce the metal for the bridge, he also invents a totally new way of constructing bridges, which requires less materials. You know, because these utopian capitalists are so amazing, they don't only invent unobtainium supermetals, they also invent totally new ways to construct bridges. This is essentially the "because he's Batman" trope. You know, how does Batman know anything about literally any field of science or industry as the plot dictates? Forensics, weapons logistics, chemistry, hand-to-hand combat, computer hacking, or whatever. Because he's Batman. How does Hank know more about chemistry and the making of metals than anyone else, but also more about the physics and engineering of bridge construction? Because he's a utopian capitalist. The State Science Institute, the government's scientific arm, wants to steal Rearden metal because they're so bureaucratic and uninventive and wasting the public's money, and they don't want this private entrepreneur's new invention to make them look bad. This is the same argument that anarcho-capitalist types give when talking about new inventions such as the cell phone.
The fact that a few rich people bought the first $4,000 cell phone back in 1983 is the very reason that a low-income individual can now buy a $50 smartphone today.
In 1983, Motorola made the first cell phone. It was bigger than a brick, it had terrible reception, it had a half-hour battery life, and cost $4,000. When rich people buy these things, that brings the production up, and therefore brings the cost of making these things down. Rich people buying these things brought the prices down and made cell phones affordable for everyone.
Now we all have them, but when Motorola manufactured the first one in 1983, it was the size of a brick, had a half-hour battery life, reception was terrible, and calls were very expensive. It cost $4,000. If they only bought that $4,000 brick, there would be a $40 cell phone today.
I've talked about this before, but basically this idea has no basis in reality. Private companies are worried about the bottom line, about their profit margins, so they don't fund the very costly and risky work of research and development. Instead, they rely on grants and government scientists and military scientists to do it. Anyway, of course Hank refuses to sell the rights to Rearden Metal, so Rearden Metal starts being demonized by the government, which also hurts Taggart Transcontinental since the metal is being used so much in the railroad construction. So, Dagny and Hank decide that they want to form their own railroad company together, taking on all the risks and bad press, and then when they finish the rail, they can give the company over to Taggart Transcontinental and save the day. In the world of the book, the term, "Who is John Galt?" refers to something helpless or failed. Why is the government so bureaucratic? Who is John Galt? Why is steel never delivered on time? Who is John Galt? And so Dagny and Hank decide to name their company the John Galt Line, to spit in the face of the hopelessness invoked by that phrase. Because of the contradictory nature of this book, there's a lot of inconsistencies here. Like, no one wants to invest in the John Galt Line because they all think Rearden Metal is dangerous. Yet, everyone secretly invests in the company because they all know they're going to make a return on their investment because Rearden Metal is just so awesome. Also, the unions hate the John Galt Company because they reject unions and regulations and safety recommendations and they use scabs and all that. And yet, the company is flooded with workers. More applicants than I can hire. I don't think the union is going to interfere. Most of the applicants are giving phony names. They're union members. They need the work desperately. Over the course of the story, there isn't really a lot of talk about the making of Rearden Metal or of the John Galt Line. The book, I realize, has main characters to focus on, but there really isn't any time given to the average people doing the work. Again, it seems like Ayn Rand literally thinks that Bezos alone runs Amazon. Elon Musk alone runs Tesla, or whatever. The newspapers complain that Rearden Metal is dangerous and that Hank and Dagny are greedy. They ask, "What protection does society have against the arrogance, selfishness, and greed of two unbridled individualists whose records are conspicuously devoid of any publicly spirited actions?" And the public is saying, "When they run the first train on the John Galt Line, the rail will split. They'll never get to the bridge. If they do, the bridge will collapse under the engine." Schoolboys and retired workers line the track armed with rifles to protect the rail from attack. As the train passes, all those standing guards salute with their rifles, and every town the train passes, people are on the rooftops and in the streets waving and cheering. Again, this is totally inconsistent. The John Galt Line and this bridge of Rearden Metal are both distrusted and hated by the public, who are also flooding the streets and rooftops cheering them on. This is a concept called selective populism, which is going to come up when we discuss Umberto Eco's 14 Features of Fascism. As the train goes over the bridge and everything goes off without a hitch, Dagny goes to the engine room and starts yelling and being all enamored and inebriated by the whole experience. I'm pretty sure she wants to have sex with the train, or like Ayn Rand wants to do it with trains or something. Anyway, Hank and Dagny hook up, and Dagny talks about how she wants to be totally used and diminished into an object for Hank's use. Meanwhile, the dystopian bleeding heart Jim Taggart meets a girl who is a temporarily embarrassed millionaire, a temporarily embarrassed utopian capitalist. That is to say, she has the mindset of Hank and Dagny, but she's just a poor entry-level cashier person. Anyway, this woman and Jim hit it off, mostly because she thinks that he is also a utopian capitalist. They discuss Rearden Metal, and Jim states, "Rearden, he didn't invent smelting and chemistry and air compression. He couldn't have invented his metal, but for thousands and thousands of other people." Basically, this is the all is made by all argument popularized by Peter Kropotkin. I've used this clip many times in other videos, but it just explains this idea so concisely.
There is not even a thought or an invention which is not common property, born of the past in the present. Every new invention is a synthesis, the result of innumerable inventions which have preceded it in the vast field of mechanics and industry.
Dagny and Hank decide to celebrate their success and go on a road trip through the country. Everything is abandoned factories and overgrown and dilapidated and such. But in one abandoned motor factory, they find the remnants of an unfinished engine that was designed to run on static electricity from the atmosphere. A free energy source, for all practical purposes, a perpetual motion engine. You know, on top of unobtainium supermetals and totally new bridge construction, they also invent a perpetual motion engine, apparently. In the meantime, more utopian capitalists disappear, and the government passes new regulations limiting the speed of trains and how many cars they can pull, and limits the amount of rooted metal that can be produced. You know, because government regulation isn't done for the purpose of safety or anything like that, but simply for ruinous over-regulation of business. Dagny goes to the banker who provided the loans for the factory where the perpetual motion engine was found to try and find out who made the engine so it could be finished. And the banker explains, "I wasn't concerned with the parasites of office and laboratory. I was concerned with the real workers, the men with calloused hands." And, "I can proudly say that in all my life I have never made a profit." Basically, the banker is a dystopian bleeding heart who paid too much attention to the parasites and ignored the utopian capitalists. And so it's the fault of men like him that the various factories in the countryside are all out of business. Dagny then talks to the siblings who owned the factory where the perpetual motion engine was found, and one of them explains, "We put into place that noble historical precept, from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. Everyone in the factory, from chairwoman to president, received the same salary." She explains that they ran the factory all super socialist with democratic meetings and everything, and of course they totally failed. Who would have thought that Ayn Rand would completely misunderstand Marxism as contrary to the self-interest of human nature, rather than greatly informed by it? Anyway, Dagny discovers that the man who invented the engine left the minute that this evil democratic workplace plan was announced. Oh, by the way, keep in mind that this motor factory's new plan made it so that everyone was paid the exact same. Part 2. Either or. We then meet Dr. Stadler, the president of the State Science Institute. He's mad that the modern scientists are all rationality-denying, postmodern neo-Marxists. He reads from a recent book by Dr. Floyd Ferris, the lead thinker of this postmodern neo-Marxist movement, which was published by the Institute. It states, "Do not expect consistency. Everything is a contradiction of everything else. Nothing exists but contradiction." I don't want to get into a big thing about this, but I and many other folks have discussed Marx and Hegel and what they had to say about contradiction in more detail, so look there if you want to understand more. But for our purposes here, I'll just say that Marx didn't believe in contradiction like he believed up was down, rich was poor, or whatever, but rather he believed that these systems of gravity or economics or whatever had contradictions, had conflicting relationships within themselves. Up lives in contradiction and conflict with down. The rich live in conflict and contradiction with the poor, and so on. Also, if you're hip, you'll recognize that our colleges and institutes are infected with reality-denying postmodernists type argument is basically your standard cultural Bolshevism, cultural Marxism, the Frankfurt School is the Illuminati, fascist anti-intellectual BS. Anyway, Dagny asks Dr. Stadler, "Yo, leading scientist guy, do you know anyone who might have invented this here perpetual motion engine? And if not, could you recommend someone for the job?" And Dr. Stadler explains, "I don't know who might have started it, but I do know this one scientist who hates the government and hates social responsibility, and he's a total utopian capitalist. You'd love him." And so she hires this scientist to finish the job. Meanwhile, the government passes more and more regulations. Now train cars can only go 50 miles an hour and only carry like 40 cars. Using coal and other outdated technology is becoming common again because the regulations are so bad they're reverting things backwards. And more utopian capitalists are disappearing. Dagny calls the man who is taking away the utopian capitalists the destroyer, because he is destroying the economy. The State Science Institute demands Reardon metal for this thing called Project X, but again Hank refuses, because he doesn't want to sell anything to the government even though it is now against the law for him to refuse. And he's all like, "My objective self-interest dictates that I shall not be forced to arm my own murderers with the weapons with which they wish to murder me with." Later, Hank and Dagny talk about how the folks in government actually know that what they are doing is wrong. Hank says, "They want us to pretend that we see the world as they pretend they see it." Again, getting a little fashy here. Them in the government are pulling the strings. They know what they're doing. They know what they're doing is wrong and manipulative, but they're doing it anyway. This is the obsession with the plot stuff from the 14 Features of Fascism. Oh, also, there's a bunch of parts here where Hank buys Dagny expensive gifts and orders her around, and how much she likes being reduced to an object for his desires. Very 50 Shades of Grey. But wait, aren't the utopian capitalists supposed to love selfishness and not like being reduced to an object for someone else? Isn't that literally what they hate the dystopian bleeding hearts for? Living for the benefit of someone else? Oh well. Jim Taggart and the cashier girl decide to get married, and at the wedding someone says, "Money is the root of all evil." And Francisco goes on this tirade about how the root of money is production, and it is the utopian capitalists who produce value, not the dystopian bleeding hearts. He states, "Money rests on the axiom that every man is the owner of his mind and his effort. Money permits no deal except those to mutual benefit by the unforced judgment of the traders." This argument assumes that everyone's relationship with money in the market is the same, but it isn't. Employees and employers have contradictory goals in the market. Workers come to the market trying to sell their labor for as much as possible to buy food and clothes and shelter, always getting back less than they put in. Employers come to the market trying to get means of production and labor as cheaply as possible in order to make a return on their investment, always coming out with more money than they put in. Look at my video on Marx's Capital for Beginners if you'd like to understand why Francisco's argument here is total bunk. At the end of the monologue, Francisco states, "Run for your life from any man who tells you that money is evil. Money is the barometer of society's virtue." In response, a woman is all like, "Francisco, you're wrong." And he says, "If you can prove me wrong, I will change my opinion." And she says, "I don't have any answers. My mind doesn't work that way, but I don't feel that you're right. I know that you're wrong. I feel it." Oh, this is the facts don't care about your feelings type argument. You know, it's very easy to win an argument when you're writing your opponent's script and ignore all the psychological and anthropological, historical, political, and economic thought that proves you're wrong, and just write your interlocutor as some kind of crybaby idiot. Francisco then tells everyone he's going to sabotage his minds to screw over the dystopian bleeding hearts, and everyone starts freaking out. And Francisco says, "I am tired of being the root of all evil, so I stopped." Then Francisco and Reardon have a long talk about their role in society, and how Reardon is a pushover who sacrifices his morals to the dystopian bleeding hearts. Francisco asks, "Hey, Hanky Panky, I'm wondering, what kinds of men would you like to see writing the John Galt line? Utopian capitalists like ourselves, or disgusting bleeding heart parasites?" He adds, "You have been called selfish for the courage of acting on your own judgment and bearing sole responsibility for your own life. You have been called antisocial for the vision that made you venture upon undiscovered roads." Yada yada yada. This whole argument is ridiculous, because again, it assumes that the Jeff Bezoses and the Bill Gateses of the world are the ones who do all the work, when in fact they live off the work of others. Anyway, Francisco changes Hank's mind about the whole state of things. Hank took the red pill and now understands the virtue of being totally selfish and not caring about anyone else. So Hank decides to go home and tell his dystopian bleeding heart wife and mother and brother he's cutting them off. After that, Hank goes to his trial. He's on trial for refusing to sell his metal to the State Science Institute. Apparently these charges are pretty serious, but Hank, speaking from the mindset he learned from Francisco, just says, "I refuse to see the law or the court as justified, and so I am removing my consent from this interaction." He states, "Whatever you wish me to do, I will do it at the point of a gun. If you sentence me to jail, you will have to send armed men to carry me there. I will not volunteer to move. Basically, the judges are all dystopian bleeding hearts who look like idiots, and Hank is all awesome, and everyone in the crowd whistles and laughs and applauds on cue with Hank's speech. Doesn't this, "if you sentence me to jail, you will have to send armed men to carry me there," kind of talk remind you of Jordan Peterson, who loved this book, surprise, surprise, when he cried about the compelled speech with the Bill C-16 stuff?
If they find me, I won't pay it. If they put me in jail, I'll go on a hunger strike. I'm not doing this. And that's that.
Anyway, apparently Hank saying he revokes his consent from the court doesn't get him in any trouble. What an interesting defense. I guess anyone who's gonna go on trial should just say that they retract their consent from the court's ruling, and the bailiff and the police and such will be powerless to do anything about it. Or no, wait, no, that only works when you're like the richest person in the country, which Hank is. So I guess this is kind of accurate, actually. Then there's more talk of overregulation, needless things like demanding all buildings be under a certain number of stories, so elevators are shut down and stairways are blocked, and eventually they cut the buildings shorter. Because remember, all regulations are only silly things that hurt business and serve no other function. Dagny walks around looking at the dilapidated world and seeing all the things like a house with a TV inside, knowing that these people don't even remember when there used to be electricity, and she thinks about how things used to be available to the poor and they're now considered luxuries. Apparently somehow people have a TV in their home but don't remember when electricity was a thing. Okay. Basically, more talk about how overregulation and such is causing technology to revert backwards. Hank's wife discovers that Hank has been sleeping with Dagny Taggart, and so they get in a fight, where Hank explains, now that I'm all selfish after talking with Francisco so much, I don't care about you. I don't care that I hurt you. You're a parasite and you suck. He states, "You are not to speak of her to me. If you ever do it again, I will answer you as I would answer a hoodlum. I will beat you up." Awesome. Cool protagonist you got there. The dystopian bleeding hearts in Washington complain that companies are going out of business left and right, and the utopian capitalists are not fulfilling their responsibility to the public good, so they implement Directive 10-289, the goal of which is the following 8 points. 1. Workers are tied to their job and can't leave or be fired. 2. All businesses and their owners must remain in business and cannot sell or close down. 3. All patents and copyrights must be turned over to the government. 4. All research and development is suspended. 5. All establishments must produce the same amount every year. Overproduction will be punished. 6. Everyone must purchase the same amount of products every year. Overconsumption will be punished. 7. All wages, salaries, and dividends are to be frozen at their current level. And 8. Anything not covered here will be ruled on by the Unification Board. Regarding Directive 10-289, the dystopian bleeding hearts say things like, "Those who are big are here to serve those who aren't. If they refuse to do their moral duty, we've got to force them. There once was an age of reason, but we've progressed beyond it. This is the age of love." This is more fashy, anti-intellectual, cultural Marxism type stuff. Now, I see what Ayn Rand is trying to do here. Remember, this was written after the New Deal in what Ayn Rand saw as America becoming a communist totalitarian hellhole. And so Directive 10-289 is supposed to be some sort of nationalization collectivist strategy that brings this about. But none of this is present in any of the 8 points named. It would make much more sense if Directive 10-289 mirrored the democratic workplace measures that were put in place in that motor company that destroyed itself. This would still be wrong, but at least then the arguments would be consistent. Anyway, the government then blackmails Hank, threatening to expose his affair with Dagny Taggart if he refuses to sign the rights of Rearden Metal over to the government. And Hank goes on this long monologue like, "Damn, I am such a cool utopian capitalist. All us utopian capitalists are totally punished for being the coolest, best, smartest, most totally good-looking people in the world by the twisted morals of all these lazy, good-for-nothing parasites. If it wasn't for the international Jewish... if it wasn't for the dystopian bleeding hearts in government encouraging degeneracy and distorting the economy, all us awesome capitalists would be free to reach our full potential." In the end, Hank gives in to the blackmail and signs Rearden Metal over to the government. It turns out the government had a metal factory in the middle of nowhere ready to go to make Rearden metal long before Hank signed the rights to them. But then, the day Hank gave them the rights, a loudspeaker at the factory warned everyone to leave, and then it was bombed by some unknown terrorist named Ragnar Danaskuld. Ragnar then meets up with Hank as he walks alone at night. Ragnar explains that he is keeping gold aside for all the utopian capitalists as payback for all the taxes wrongfully stolen from them. He explains that he is the terrorist who's been blowing up factories and shipments and stuff on behalf of the utopian capitalists. He states, "Robin Hood, he was the man who robbed the rich and gave to the poor. Well, I am the man who robs the poor and gives to the rich. Or, to be exact, the man who robs the thieving poor and gives back to the productive rich." He explains, "I only attack government property and never private property because capitalism is awesome. Oh, and also I never attack military property because the military is the only justified arm of the government since its only function is to protect private property rights. So don't worry, hanky-panky. I'm going to blow up any factory that attempts to make Rearden metal on behalf of the government." Hank says he doesn't want the gold and that he will do anything in his power to report this terrorist to the police. But when police randomly show up and talk to Hank, he says nothing. In fact, he clutches the gun in his pocket in case he needs to shoot the police so Ragnar can escape. Meanwhile, a train full of dystopian bleeding hearts falls off the rails, and the government's over-regulatory bureaucratic mess is exposed, as all the bureaucratic train workers pass the buck to the next guy because no one wants to be blamed for the derailed train. In the end, they decide to send a coal-burning train to pick up the passengers, knowing that this train will then go through a very long tunnel, resulting in the death of the passengers from asphyxiation and collapse of the tunnel. Some people jump off the train and disappear into the night because they realize what's happening. As the train tunnel kills the passengers, the book explains specifically why all of these dystopian bleeding hearts on the train actually deserve to die. Let's run through some of these examples. The man in seat 5, car number 7, was a worker who believed that he had a right to a job whether his employer wanted him or not. The woman in roomette 6, car number 8, was a lecturer who believed that, as a consumer, she had a right to transportation whether the railroad people wished to provide it or not. The man in roomette 2, car number 9, was a professor of economics who advocated the abolition of private property. It's like 4 pages of this crap, really just reveling in these people's murder, really just wanting you to know that Ayn Rand thinks that maybe if all these college liberals and SJWs and bleeding heart postmodern neo-Marxist degenerates, maybe if they all got onto a train and then died, that would be a good thing. You know, I think someone else made this same argument. Mad about Directive 10-289 and the nationalization and overregulation and all that, Dagny runs away to live in a cabin in the woods. In the nearby town, Dagny talks to the local people who all let their roads fall apart and flood and let their produce go bad, and they don't try and fix anything because they're too stupid and lazy to do so. Francisco finds Dagny at her cabin, and we finally hear why he's been pretending to be a playboy buffoon the last 12 years. He states, "I shall destroy every last bit of it, every last penny of my fortune, and every ounce of copper that could feed the looters." He wants to leave nothing for the dystopian bleeding hearts to take over when he goes to disappear as the other utopian capitalists have. He adds, "Let it go. We don't need it. We can rebuild it. They can't. We'll survive without it. They won't." Boy, this us versus them stuff is pretty eugenicsy, like arguing that some people are inherently the Ubermensch while others are inherently parasitic degenerates. Dagny decides to return to Taggart Transcontinental to get to work doing all kinds of drastic things like tearing down old factories and turning the metal into railroad ties in order to cut through the bureaucratic regulatory nonsense and to compensate for the fact that so many utopian capitalists have disappeared, making it hard to get anything done. Luckily, the dystopian bleeding heart bureaucracy is so bloated and bureaucratic that it won't be able to enforce its regulations on Dagny before she's finished fixing the railroad. Also, remember that in this book, all the utopian capitalists respond to every situation like totally stoic, unfazed chads all the time. For example, when Dagny is told that Hank gave in and gave his medal to the government, she responds all like, "Oh, I see. This stoic and in-control utopian capitalist who I've been sleeping with seems to have totally sold out all of our morals unexpectedly. One would assume that I would panic or be distraught under such circumstances, but I am not, for I have objectively determined that the logical action for my rational self-interest is to come off completely inhumanely stoic and unfazed. Francisco finds Dagny at her work and tells her that, I have objectively determined that if you continue to work under the dystopian Bleeding Heart government, I will regard you as my enemy. He states, while you'll struggle to save Taggart Transcontinental, I will be working to destroy it. This is because he wants to starve the dystopian Bleeding Heart so that they all die off in some kind of final solution, if you will. But wait, if the richest guys in the world are trying intentionally to destroy the economy, isn't this whole global economic catastrophe like their fault and not actually the fault of these parasitic dystopian Bleeding Hearts who are only trying to stop the intentional destruction of the economy? Seems like a major plot hole, no? The scientist that Dagny hired to figure out how to complete the perpetual motion engine wrote her a letter saying that he's quitting, and that he doesn't want to create an engine that the looters and parasites will use. He states, I do not wish to work in a world that regards me as a slave. Oh, did I mention that despite being these totally in-control stoic chads, the utopian capitalists are actually complete crybabies? Boo-hoo-hoo, I don't want to make a perpetual motion engine. That might be used to help people on welfare, and that makes me a slave. This is basically torture and murder. Boo-hoo-hoo. Anyway, Dagny gets on a train to go and speak to the scientist about the engine. While on the train, she meets a homeless man who used to work for the motor factory where the engine was found. And the homeless man goes on to explain what caused the factory to fall apart. Well, you see, because the factory was based on each according to ability, to each according to need, the ones what's needs was met was those who's acted the neediest, and those who worked the hardest were punished. So everyone worked as little as they could get away with to maximize how much they got. He states, it turned into a contest among 6,000 panhandlers, each claiming that his need was worse than his brother's. They voted which men were the best, and these men were sentenced to work overtime each night for the next 6 months, overtime without pay, because you weren't paid by time, you weren't paid by work, only by need. But remember when Dagny was talking to the owner of the motor factory, and I asked you to keep in mind that she said that every worker was paid the same? Whatever happened to that? Where's the consistency in this frickin' book? Anyway, Ayn Rand's explanation of worker-run factories has a lot more to do with her hatred of democracy and the working class than with reality. I mean, just think about it. Who do you think is going to be more dedicated to their job? Some wage slave working under an unelected totalitarian boss who wants them to work as hard as possible for as little pay as possible? Or a democratic workplace in which the worker has a say in the functioning of the workplace and gets a share of the profits produced? Next, the homeless man explains that this mischievous failed democratic plot was intentional. He states, they didn't do it by any kind of mistake. Mistakes of this size are never made innocently. This fits into the obsession with a plot feature of Umberto Eco's 14 Features of Fascism. The homeless man then explains, at the very first meeting, when we voted to make the workplace democratic, this little whippersnapper named John Galt stood up and shouted, I will stop the motor of the world. And he stormed out. And then when the factory closed, people began saying, who is John Galt? As the factories all over the place started closing down, this became a common phrase. The train Dagny is on breaks down, and everyone on the train is a fat, lazy, dystopian Bleeding Heart who doesn't want to help solve the situation, so Dagny gets on a plane to try to fly to where the scientist who is working on the engine is. But when she gets there, one of the employees says that the scientist just left with some stranger, and he points to an airplane in the sky. Oh no! Yet another dystopian capitalist to be disappeared by the destroyer. So Dagny jumps in her plane to follow them. The scientist and destroyer fly over some valley and vanish out of sight. Dagny keeps circling lower and lower to try and spot the plane, but it just looks like an empty valley. And then, her plane crashes. Part 3. A is A. Dagny wakes up in John Galt's Gulch. It turns out that the gulch is this hidden valley protected by some kind of Wakanda-style optical illusion. John Galt himself is the first one on the scene to make sure that she's okay. And he is super sexy, obviously. Dagny sees all the utopian capitalists who had disappeared, and it's this wonderful capitalist utopia. the famous composer she likes is there, and he's playing his new music, which is all classical and good, and not like that new degenerate type music that's popular with the dystopian Bleeding Hearts. Gotta get that neo-Nazi style art critique in there. Oh, and also, there's a 3-foot tall golden dollar sign floating in the middle of town as the town's coat of arms. John Galt explains that, logically, you know what? I don't think I have the pipes to pull off this character. Let me phone a friend to cover it for me. Hopefully the ADR isn't too noticeable.
Logically and rationally and objectively, I had to remove the scientist who completed my perpetual motion engine from the equation, because such an engine would have saved the economy, and thus wrecked my plans for destroying the economy, and causing all the dystopian bleeding hearts and parasites to die off.
Again, if the dystopian Bleeding Hearts are such useless parasites, they should be destroying the economy and dying off on their own, right? Like, doesn't Ragnar blowing up the factories and John Galt hiding all the inventors and the new inventions, doesn't this active destruction of the economy work against the premise of the book? Well, this all plays into a few concepts from Umberto Eco's 14 Features of Fascism. Basically, in fascist ideology, there is a conspiracy around a plot fueled by an enemy which is both strong and weak, both reigning over you and beneath you. In Hitler's time, the argument was that there's a parasitic Illuminati made up of you-know-who was promoting degeneracy and Marxism in the culture and economy. They were running everything behind the scenes, but were also naturally degenerate and inferior to the master race. And in our modern times, neo-Nazi folks will argue that feminism and LGBT plus ideology and hip-hop and illegal immigration, all these elements of society are promoted by you-know-who, of course, and all these elements of society are naturally weaker and more inferior than the white race or Western culture or whatever, and yet they're all controlling and running everything behind the scenes. And it's the same here with Atlas Shrugged. The dystopian Bleeding Hearts are plotting to take over the economy and destroy the utopian capitalists, who they are also naturally inferior to. John Galt's Gulch is powered by his perpetual motion engine. That's how they survive in the valley. One guy tells Dagny, "I'm the hog farmer and the airfield attendant." This is actually almost a Conquest of Bread style utopia, where people are sharing in the rote entry-level work and also sharing the interesting work. Another man explains that, "I work for use, not for profit." Again, this is some Marxist-type arguments, and Ayn Rand doesn't even know it. John Galt talks about how they only use pure gold as currency in the Gulch. He states,
"We don't accept any other currency in this valley. We accept nothing but objective value."
You know, because the value of gold is objective and not subjective, apparently. If you saw Knowing Better's video on capitalism and libertarianism, you saw that Ayn Rand would often use flawed arguments like this. For example, she said that an airplane is objectively better than a bicycle. But is this true? From a global travel and speed standpoint, sure, but what about from an environmental or affordability or community access standpoint? In that case, no, the bicycle is better. But that's the goal of objectivism, the name of Ayn Rand's philosophy, to attempt to make objective claims about things that are clearly subjective. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that Ayn Rand is objectively stupid. John Galt explains that there is an oath that you have to pledge before you can live in John Galt's Gulch, and it goes as follows.
"I swear by my life and my love of it that I will never live for the sake of another man, or ask another man to live for mine."
But didn't Dagny already fail this when she wanted to reduce herself to an object for Hank's desires? I'm guessing that Ayn Rand did not notice this inconsistency. Anyways, Dagny is upset that they are not sharing these wondrous discoveries and inventions with the rest of the world, and John Galt explains that they are on strike, and then he goes on this giant crybaby monologue about how
"We inventors of the world, all through history, have done all these wonderful things that have made everyone's lives better, and for our work, we've been victimized and tortured."
John Galt is turning class consciousness on its head. He argues,
"We've heard it shouted that the industrialist is a parasite, and that his workers support him, create his wealth, make his luxury possible, and what would happen to him if they walked out. Very well, I propose to show the world who depends on whom, who supports whom."
So, there's a documentary right here on YouTube called The Take by Naomi Klein. It's about that time that hundreds of capitalists abandoned their factories in Argentina and the workers took them over. This clearly demonstrates what happens when the owners walk out. Guess what? The workers take over and run the factory themselves. It's in fact the owners who rely on the workers. John Galt, and by extension Ayn Rand, just hold a worldview that is the opposite of reality. Apparently, John Galt's Gulch is almost self-sufficient, and the things that they can't produce, they buy through black market pipelines so that none of the money goes to the dystopian bleeding hearts. Keep in mind that the Gulch is almost self-sufficient for just a second. A friend of John Galt says that Dagny is the only woman from the outside world fit enough or brave enough to enter John Galt's Gulch, or be worthy of it. Cool, Smurfette type situation, apparently. Actually, this is as good a time as any to point out that Dagny Taggart is perhaps, well, the only fit or brave woman in the story. I'm sure you noticed that over the course of this synopsis, I haven't given any names for female characters. There's Dagny Taggart, and then Hank Rearden's mom and wife, and Jim Taggart's wife. That's because that's essentially how the text treats them. There's Dagny Taggart, a few important government and capitalist dudes, and then 2 or 3 females acting as their foil. Francisco arrives at the Gulch and explains that he's going to start a new copper company in the mountains nearby. It's interesting because, the world is starving for resources, but apparently this little hidden valley magically has all these resources in it. Remember when I asked you to keep in mind that the valley is almost self-sufficient, somehow? Well, this is a key feature of anarcho-capitalism, capitalist libertarian worldview. Do you remember that thought slime video about how ANCAPs think the world is like Minecraft? Their worldview only works if you pretend that there is always some magical untouched land out there, with all the iron ore and copper and potable water and arable land you could need. John Galt's Gulch is just this magically untouched valley with all the resources they could need for new inventions in food and water to almost live self-sufficiently off of. Somehow. We then get a little backstory about our utopian capitalist heroes. There were 2 professors who mentored John Galt and Francisco d'Anconia and Ragnar Danneskjöld, the architects of this utopian capitalist strike. They are Hugh Axton, a philosophy professor and good reasoning boy utopian capitalist who now lives at John Galt's Gulch, and Dr. Robert Stadler, the physicist professor and head of the State Science Institute. And despite being mad about the postmodern neo-Marxist thought taking over the institute, he sells out his utopian capitalist beliefs to win favor and social approval from the dystopian bleeding hearts. Explaining the split between these 2 professors is kind of supposed to be like the War of Wrath prior to the Lord of the Rings books, or the Clone Wars prior to the old Star Wars movies. It's the big rift that happens before the story, creating the conflict that our current characters are now existing in. In the end, Dagny decides to leave John Galt's Gulch and continue fighting the dystopian bleeding hearts to try and run Taggart Transcontinental and make the economy work. Meanwhile, Dr. Floyd Ferris, the main postmodern guy, brings Dr. Stadler to a meeting of a bunch of bureaucrats in a field in the middle of nowhere. They are demonstrating the completed Project X, a weapon credited to Dr. Stadler without his knowledge or permission. The weapon uses sound waves, and they demonstrate its power by destroying a barn and killing the livestock around it. Stadler asks what is the purpose of such a monstrous invention, and Ferris explains, "It will relieve social frictions. It will promote peace, stability, and, as we have indicated, harmony. It will eliminate all danger of war." The Railroad Unification Board announces that train companies will operate on each other's tracks free of charge for each according to need. Dagny is expected to make a radio broadcast where she will tell the public everything's fine and to trust the government and the Railroad Unification Plan, and that she totally didn't run away to go live in a cabin because of Directive 10-289. The public is a little on edge because of all the utopian capitalists disappearing and the economy collapsing around them, and the government wants Dagny to ease their minds about all that. But when she goes on the radio program, she's all like, "Yo, Hank Rearden and I have been totally hooking up, and the lazy good-for-nothing government used this affair to blackmail Hank in assigning Rearden metal over to the government. Now they're trying to blackmail me. Truth exposed. Government sucks. Capitalism rules. Mic drop." Everyone is stunned, and the radio program is cut off the air. Dagny leaves, and all the dystopian bleeding hearts are just dumbfounded. When Dagny gets home, Hank is there, and they talk, and Hank comes to understand that Dagny has met John Galt and is now in love with him. It's funny because these utopian capitalists are all obsessed with Dagny Taggart, but they're also such total chads that they understand her moving on. Dagny leaves Francisco for the objectively more Chad Hank Reardon, and then leaves Hank for the objectively more Chad John Galt. Later, Jim Taggart tells his wife that on September 2nd, the government will nationalize Francisco's copper mines. But wait, didn't Jim find out at the wedding that Francisco's been secretly trying to destroy them? Oh well. Anyway, Jim brags about how he's going to be richer and better than Dagny and Hank and Francisco and that whole utopian capitalist sponge. But Jim's wife, remember, is a utopian capitalist, and she reflects on how she thinks that Hank and Dagny are cool, and how all the art and novels and music of the modern era that she has seen now that she's a wealthy socialite is all degenerate and childish. Basically some more neo-Nazi art critique about how we have to go back to when art was a celebration of our Western values and not this postmodern filth, or whatever. Over the course of this conversation, Jim's wife is slowly discovering that he is not the utopian capitalist she thought he was. So she goes to talk to Dagny and explain how she knows that Dagny is awesome and Jim sucks. She states, "I married Jim because I thought he was you." Apparently everyone thinks Dagny is just so hot and cool, all the industrialist guys want to bang her, her secretary wants to bang her, and now even her sister-in-law wants in on the action. Meanwhile, Hank Reardon's wife goes to Jim Taggart to complain that she doesn't want to get a divorce and lose all her money, and the two of them, the two dystopian bleeding hearts, hook up. And of course it's explained as all lazy and gross and not at all like Dagny and Hank's affair, even though they're essentially the same. Jim's wife comes home to find out that Jim had an affair and they get in a fight. And Jim explains that he only married a worthless white trash girl because then all she would ever own would belong to him. However, when she started to rise socially and act more like a rich person, she became what he couldn't, because she's naturally a utopian capitalist and he isn't. This realization causes her to go insane, and she runs out of the house, running around in the dark city streets, banging her fists on the walls until they bleed. She knows that any business she tries to build will be destroyed by the government's overregulations, so she runs around like a crazed animal, throws herself off the roof of a building, and dies. This is what I mean by none of the female characters being very strong in the text. Jim Taggart's wife is supposed to be the closest thing to the strength and confidence of Dagny Taggart, and upon finding out that her husband is a lazy bureaucrat, she goes insane, runs around like a deranged animal, and kills herself. Later, Jim wants Dagny to hear the September 2nd radio broadcast announcing the nationalization of Francisco's copper mines. Jim wants to brag to Dagny that he and the other dystopian bleeding hearts have triumphed over them. Yet, at 9 a.m., every employee of Francisco's copper mines is taken off the premises, and right as the nationalization plan passes, every Francisco copper mine on Earth blows up. Hank Reardon divorces his wife, and also finds out that when his employees quit, they're replaced with government stooges. This is suspicious. Dagny is continuing to break all kinds of laws running Taggart Transcontinental, and at a meeting with workers, she sees John Galt undercover among them, and she follows him and is all like, "John Galt, I have rationally determined that you are objectively the most Chad capitalist on Earth, and so that's why you're so frickin' hot," and they bone. Afterwards, John Galt explains that he's been spying on Dagny for like 10 years, working as a handyman for the train company. But that's kind of weird. Which is it? Is he a super sexy ultimate Chad? Or is he a creep who's been stalking some lady for like a decade? Anyway, all the liberal newspapers are giving all these stories about how bad the workers have it, next to stories about how good the rich have it, trying to sow discord. "Inequalities still exist among us," the newspapers were saying, "and cheating us of the benefits of our enlightened age. Privations have worn the nerves and tempers of the people. The situation is reaching the danger point. We fear an outbreak of violence. We fear an outbreak of violence," the newspapers kept repeating. And this is followed by stories of workers attacking foremen and factory machinery. Because, mainstream media covering and even encouraging workers striking and rioting, this is totally historically accurate. Just don't, look at any labor history or media history. Don't read The Rise and Repression of Radical Labor or Manufacturing Consent or anything like that. Hank goes home and his ex-wife explains that she slept with the depraved, degenerate Jim Taggart back when her and Hank were still married, and Hank says he doesn't care and leaves. The funny part about this is, isn't it the logic of the world of the book that Jim is supposed to be looked up to? He's the president of a railroad company and a big Washington government hotshot. But with the logic of the book, it's like everyone knows all the government people are parasites, but they also celebrate them. Again, this is the enemy must be both strong and weak, and the selective populism stuff from Umberto Eco's 14 Features of Fascism. Next, Hank goes to meet with the government. They want to start a steel unification plan similar to the railroad unification plan. And Hank explains, "A steel unification board would just mean cannibalizing my business to feed all the other unsuccessful ones, because I am super cool and everyone else in my line of work sucks by comparison." Hank then has this internal dialogue about how working with the dystopian bleeding hearts has led to the downfall of the world, and that he should have never given in to them. He states, "From the first extortion he had accepted, from the first directive he had obeyed, he had given them cause to believe that reality was a thing to be cheated." After the meeting, Hank goes back to his factory, but it's all like on fire and people dying and shooting guns and stuff. One of Hank's employees is there and explains, before dying, "Listen, that riot, it's staged on orders from Washington. It's not workers, not your workers. It's those new boys of theirs and a lot of goons hired on the outside." Apparently, the government had staged a riot at his factory as an excuse to push through the Steel Unification Board. Ah, yes, the government secretly plotting with the workers against the capitalist owners. Totally a real normal thing that happens, and don't you dare look at any labor history about that. In the riot at his factory, Hank is injured, but is saved and taken to John Galt's Gulch. All over the country, people are rising up against the economic collapse. There were districts that rose in blind rebellion, arrested the local officials, expelled the agents of Washington, killed the tax collectors, then, announcing their succession from the country, went on to the final extreme of the very evil that had destroyed them, as if fighting murder with suicide, went on to seize all property within their reach, to declare community bondage of all to all, and to perish within a week, their meager loot consumed in the bloody hatred of all for all. So, because the bureaucrats of the world are dystopically incompetent, and because all the wealthiest capitalists are all actively destroying the economy, various communities break off and form anarcho-communist type societies, which, because this is an Ayn Rand book, all obliterate themselves in their evil, wicked hatred. The government asks everyone to listen to the radio or watch TV on November 22nd, so they can explain what's going on and calm everyone down. But then the day comes, and a wall of radio waves block all the TV and radio transmissions. It's like the Joker in some Batman episode. Someone has taken over and is broadcasting on all channels. If you know anything about this book, you know that there's a part where John Galt gives a giant speech talking about how awesome right-wing libertarian capitalism is. Well, that part's now. Let's take a look.
For 12 years you've been asking, who is John Galt? This is John Galt speaking. This city is afraid of me. I've seen its true face. All the whores and politicians will look up and shout, "Save us!" And I'll look down and whisper, "No."
Wait, sorry. That's Rorschach's quote from The Watchmen. I get them confused. But jokes aside, this speech is like 60 pages long. I'm not about to go over the whole thing. I'm just going to hit on, let's say, the most relevant and or stupidest parts. Let's get into it. First, he explains why the utopian capitalists are on strike.
We are on strike against self-immolation. We are on strike against the creed of unearned rewards and unrewarded duties. We are on strike against the dogma that the pursuit of one's happiness is evil.
Blah, blah, blah. Next, John Galt divides human history into two categories, which he considers equally mischievous and evil. Those who told people to live their lives for God, the religious, and those who told people to live their lives for their neighbor, the collectivists. He states,
For centuries, the battle of morality was fought between those who claimed that your life belongs to God and those who claimed that it belongs to your neighbors.
John Galt is against all that and wants everyone to, surprise, surprise, live only for themselves. He then besmirches both giving and receiving charity, stating,
If you are selfless and virtuous when you give it, are they not selfish and vicious when they take it? It is immoral to earn, but moral to mooch?
And this is basically misunderstanding how social goods are provided. If we all put money in to build roads and schools and fire departments and social services or whatever, it is not that one person is giving and another taking. We are all giving and all taking, working together to create something better than what we could produce individually. He then talks about how it is insanity to value things that have no value. Therefore, rather than giving aid to the destitute, we should treat them according to their value, as worthless. He of course talks about how the dystopian bleeding hearts don't want to just return to the Dark Ages, but to the darkest age of human history. He then gets on that Jordan Peterson cultural Marxism Frankfurt School conspiracy angle, stating,
Walk into any college classroom, and you'll hear your professors teaching your children that man can be certain of nothing, that his consciousness has no validity whatever.
Yes, because understanding that our perception can be flawed, or that many concepts such as currency or gender that we treat as objective are actually socially constructed, this is the same as believing up is down and right is wrong and all that. Also, you know Jordan Peterson totally considers himself the real John Galt, right?
I've read everything I can get my hands on in the development of authoritarian political systems, and I know the literature inside out and backwards. And I am not going to be a mouthpiece for language that I detest. And that's that.
He then spouts off a couple of sentences ending in blank out. Just kind of nonsense fare that's already been expressed.
A student reading a book understands it through a process of blank out. A scientist working on an invention is engaged in the activity of blank out.
Etc., etc. The most notable one here is this.
Every man, they announce, owns an equal share of the technological benefits created in the world. Created by who? Blank out.
This quote is again more denying of the fact that all is made by all. Next, John Galt states,
They do not want to own your fortune. They want you to lose it. They do not want to succeed. They want you to fail. They do not want to live. They want you to die. They desire nothing. They hate existence.
No. That's hilariously not true. I've read the Communist Manifesto, The Conquest of Bread, ABC of Anarchism, and others. In fact, here's a quote that you might remember from my recent review of the ABC of Anarchism. What is there really to destroy? The wealth of the rich? Nay, that is something we want the whole of society to enjoy. I can't believe Ayn Rand is so naive to just argue that her political opponents just hate life and want to die. Why do people take this crap seriously again? Ayn Rand, fan of the show. I know you're watching from beyond the grave. Let me tell you, this is not a good look. Anyways, John Galt then states,
You are letting this greatest of countries be devoured by any scum from any corner of the earth, while you concede that it is selfish to live for your country and that your moral duty is to live for the globe.
Oof. I thought the us versus them stuff was pretty mask off, but god damn. A few times now, he's already rejected the all is made by all argument, but now he's about to completely reverse it. He states,
When you work in a modern factory, you are paid not only for your labor, but for all the productive genius which has made that factory possible.
He argues that a blacksmith gets the benefit of Rearden metal without having to invent it themselves. And yeah, when we work together, we can make something better than what we could produce individually, but in a capitalist system where workers have no say in the means of production, new inventions can make your work easier, but that's never the goal. It's typically the byproduct of a far more likely goal, such as increasing productivity or decreasing the cost of labor. Under something like socialism, automation is great for everyone. But under our current system, do you think that workers are thrilled when some new machine is invented that decreases their wages or hours or automates them out of a job altogether? John Galt ends his speech essentially saying,
All my fellow utopian capitalists out there, the rational, objective thing for you to do is to only work the bare minimum to ensure the dystopian bleeding hearts die off. You should also create capitalist enclaves like I've done with the John Galt's Gulch thing, so that your beautiful capitalist utopians will be the economic centers of the new country that will emerge from the rubble.
Because apparently, even though the country is totally starved for resources, these utopian capitalists can just totally find new enclaves full of resources all over the place, apparently. Again, right-wing capitalist libertarian types thinking that the world is like Minecraft, where you could just go homestead a few acres of land wherever and find all the precious metals and potable water and arable land you need. Yeah, that's not how that works. Anyway, that's the long and short of it, and the broadcast ends. Oh, hey, do you remember that part at the end of Das Kapital where the Super Chad main character says that people who agree with him are totally objectively rational super geniuses, and anyone who disagrees must have been tricked, or are just plain evil and only believe what they believe because they hate life and want to die? Don't you remember that part that Marx wrote? No? Because that's dumb and naive? Okay, cool, just checking. Anyway, the government freaks out. They're totally panicked. They're losing it. They don't know if they should deny the speech or claim credit for it. Do you remember that part at the end of Das Kapital where when the Chad main character was done with his speech, all the capitalists turned into shriveling crybabies? Anyways, the government decides that they have to kill John Galt, or at the very least, force him to tell them where all the other utopian capitalists are hiding so that they can force them to fix everything. So the dystopian Bleeding Hearts tail Dagny so that she will lead them to John Galt. Everyone is being really hush-hush about the broadcast. However, all over the country, houses are being abandoned and businesses are going up in flames with the owners disappearing. The radio broadcasts keep asking for John Galt to come to negotiate with the government, while also broadcasting that they've already captured him. Little John Galt's Gulch-style capitalist enclaves start popping up in the mountains. Apparently, the homeless or starving people who go to these settlements looking for food are called Indians, as a derogatory term. Kinda racist, but I suppose if Ayn Rand is gonna call all the average people parasites, demonizing the Native Americans isn't much of a stretch. You remember how after they hooked up, John Galt told Dagny that he'd been stalking her for like a decade as a grunt worker for Taggart Transcontinental? Well, wanting to see John Galt again, Dagny searches her employee records and finds his address. Even though "who is John Galt" is this widely used catchphrase, no one thought it noteworthy that some guy named John Galt had been working for Taggart Transcontinental for the last decade. Anyway, when she goes to see him, he explains that she must have been followed by government spies. But apparently it says John Galt right on the door of his apartment, and he's in the Taggart Transcontinental employee records as John Galt. So is the government just idiots? How could they not put two and two together to find this guy? Either way, John Galt says that Dagny needs to pretend that she hates him and wants to turn him over to the government so that she isn't captured alongside him. The government comes in with guns to take John Galt away to some guarded room to try and convince him to give up the strike and work with the government. All the leading aspects of the dystopian Bleeding Heart government are there to get a chance to convince John Galt to work with them. These conversations are actually much more interesting than the big broadcasted speech. It's more of a Socratic dialogue. The liberal media person, the liberal academic, the liberal bureaucrat, and even the liberal capitalist all chiming in. Unfortunately, the general public doesn't get a part in this dialogue, but they either already agree with John Galt or they are parasites, according to Ayn Rand, so there really wasn't any hope for that. Mr. Thompson, who's like the president, states, "In the field of production, we will do whatever you say. You'll be the economic dictator of the nation." They offer John Galt absolutely anything he wants, provided it's some middle ground that does not involve the complete destruction of the bureaucratic government. They ask what is something that John Galt would change about the current system, and he states,
"Then start by abolishing all income taxes."
But they can't do that. Mr. Thompson says that he could make it so John Galt can't leave the room, that he would starve in there, or he could have the men with guns come in and kill him. And then John Galt says,
"I've forced your hand, causing you to logically deduce that you cannot offer me anything. You can only take things away."
Which is only true because he is making it true. The government is offering him all kinds of things, and then he's refusing them. And then they make demands, and he says, "Haha, see, the root of all your power is violence." This kind of reminds me of that old Jon Stewart argument about how Republicans are in a unique position because they say that government doesn't work, and then when they fail to do their job, they say, "Look, see, we told you government doesn't work." One of the dystopian Bleeding Hearts is all like, "Look, John, everyone is begging for your help. Here are bags of letters from school children and crippled people asking you to save the economy." And John Galt is all like,
"Is that a feeling argument I hear? Well, facts don't care about your feelings."
Dr. Robert Stadler, the once mentor utopian capitalist professor who is now a sellout dystopian Bleeding Heart, is apparently the only person that John Galt wants to speak to. But he was the bureaucrat crying most about not wanting to speak to him. But too bad for him, because now he's being forced in the room at gunpoint. The whole conversation is Dr. Stadler crying and complaining, while John Galt just sits there all stoic and silent. Dr. Stadler is saying things like, "I couldn't help it, John. I couldn't help it. It's not what I intended. John, I'm not to blame for it. They're mindless animals moved by irrational feelings, by their greed, grasping blind, unaccountable feelings." He argues that, "John, it would have worked if you hadn't taken them from us." Which I kind of agree with, right? Like, if the economy was falling apart on its own, the book makes more sense. But because John Galt and his friends are actively destroying the economy, it is their fault that it's happening. In the end, Dr. Stadler states, "You won't win. You can't be allowed to win. You are the man who has to be destroyed." And John Galt finally speaks and is like,
I am cool and stoic, and you have just exposed the evil conclusion of what happens when you compromise with the dystopian bleeding hearts.
And Dr. Stadler is all like, "Oh no, I'm defeated by my own logic. I've been so utterly destroyed by your incredible awesomeness." And he pounds on the door, demanding to be let out. As everything's falling apart, Dr. Stadler decides that because he was credited with Project X, he should be the one to control it. He wants to make a feudal society with him at the top, using the weapon to control the area. But when he gets there, Project X is being controlled by Cuffy Meggs, the old director of the unification of the railroad board, who, wears army uniforms and carries a pistol. It's Cuffy Meggs versus Dr. Stadler, the bureaucratic thug versus the bureaucratic scientist, brain versus brawn. But in the end, neither of them are utopian capitalists, so they both suck. Dr. Stadler says that the machine was declared made by him, so he should control it. Cuffy laughs and starts putting his hands all over the buttons and levers in arrogance, and Dr. Stadler yells at him, saying, "Stop, you idiot! What are you doing?" Which causes Cuffy to indignantly keep messing with the buttons and controls, which causes the weapon to target itself and fire, and the whole thing blows up. Literally up. The weapon itself flies into the sky, sending a shockwave destroying infrastructure all over the surrounding area, including the famous Rearden Metal train bridge. We now go back to the dystopian Bleeding Heart bureaucrats. The dystopian Bleeding Hearts have made plans to escape this awful system they've created, if it ever came to that, but unfortunately, with no copper or bridges or trains or anything working, they're trapped inside the system that is collapsing around them. Then they think about this secret project they have, which has gotten 3 men to confess to murder. They want to use it on John Galt to make him say what they want to hear. The secret project they're going to is called the Ferris Persuader, named after Dr. Floyd Ferris, the leading postmodern neo-Marxist dystopian Bleeding Heart intellectual guy. Dagny flees and calls Francisco to say, "Frankie, baby, you have to save John Galt. They're going to do something awful to our poor daddy capitalist." And Francisco is all like, "Dagny doll, don't you worry. I have objectively determined that I should tell you to get ready so I can fly over and pick you up." So Dagny runs home to grab some gold, and then goes to her office to grab a picture of her grandfather Nat Taggart and a map of the old train lines. An employee is there and says, "Miss Taggart, we've been trying to get a hold of you. The Taggart Bridge has been destroyed." Dagny runs to grab the phone to get to work fixing things, but then remembers that John Galt said that if she was going to go on strike with them, she would have to leave everything behind, and how devastating it would be, and she thinks about how John Galt had to leave behind his perpetual motion engine. So, she hangs up the phone, draws a $sign at the foot of the statue of Ned Taggart, the symbol the utopian capitalists are supposed to leave behind when they go to disappear, and then she recites that oath that's all like, "It's super awesome to be selfish and never care about anyone else." Then Francisco picks her up and they leave. At the Ferris Persuader, the dystopian Bleeding Hearts tell John Galt, "We want ideas or else. We won't let you out of here until you tell us the exact measures you'll take to save our system." John Galt is strapped to a mattress in a room with all kinds of wires and buttons and stuff. This book came out 10 years after 1984, and I wonder if maybe Ayn Rand stole some of this from the torture of Winston in that book. I mean, if you saw Knowing Better's video on capitalism and libertarianism, you saw that Ayn Rand basically stole the John Galt's Gulch idea from a book called The Mysterious Valley, so who knows? The dystopian Bleeding Hearts pump an electrical current through various limbs on John Galt's body, and demand him to tell them how to fix the economy. One man yells, "I don't want him to obey. I want him to believe." Oh yeah, this is totally a 1984 ripoff. "We order you to give orders. We demand you to dictate," they cry. They shock John Galt so much that the machine breaks down. The engineer that was pushing the buttons needed to be smart enough to push buttons without being smart enough to know that torture is wrong, so he doesn't know how to fix the machine. Then, like a total Chad, John Galt explains how to fix the machine that they were using to torture him. Fun fact, electric shock as an interrogation technique is actually a lot more common than you'd think, if you read authors like William Blum who write a lot about US foreign policy. I'll let you be the judge of if this is more commonly used to electroshock interrogate wealthy capitalists, or leftist militants and labor organizers. Anyway, the guy running the machine now understands how to fix it, but also now realizes that torture is wrong, and he panics and runs away. Then, Jim Taggart, who has been chomping at the bit this whole time, is trying to fix the machine, and saying things like, "I don't care if he dies. I want him to suffer. He never screamed, not once. It's not fair. I want to hear him scream." He's so upset that it is in fact Jim that's screaming. It's like how Dr. Stadler was destroyed by the facts and logic of John Galt's stoic silence, and now Jim is being destroyed by it. Apparently, Jim Taggart never believed in any of the things he said about wanting to help people or be kind or anything like that. He just wanted to kill John Galt and consequently the whole economy and the whole country because he just loves death or whatever. Jim is so utterly destroyed by John Galt's resolve that they all decide that they have to leave John Galt strapped to the mattress and go take Jim to the hospital. Dagny, Francisco, Ragnar, and Hank all go to where John Galt is being held. Dagny goes up and talks to the guard at the front door and says, "I was sent by one of the dystopian Bleeding Heart leaders to be let in." But the guard says, "Well, I was told by a different dystopian leader not to let anyone in." Dagny points a gun at him and explains that both bureaucrats are evil and giving him opposite commands, so he must decide for himself what to do. And he can't decide, so Dagny shoots and kills him. This totally doesn't violate Knapp, because this guy refused to take charge of his own life and make his own decisions, so he was basically a dystopian Bleeding Heart and deserved to die. Apparently. But the guy did take direct orders not to let anyone in. Was he supposed to just go against that? What if he would get court-martialed or imprisoned? But I guess at this point, I really shouldn't be surprised when the book totally revels in the deaths of anyone who's labeled in cahoots with the looters. Francisco and Hank go in and kill all the other guards and free John Galt, and they get in a plane and fly back to the Gulch. There's a whole bunch of airplanes behind them because apparently the utopian capitalists were going to go to war against the dystopian Bleeding Heart government if they failed to free John Galt. Dr. Hugh Axon calls from one of the planes to hear John Galt's voice and asks if he's okay, and John Galt says,
"Of course I am, because A is A."
The book ends with Eddie Willers, Dagny's old secretary and right-hand man, as the head of Taggart Transcontinental. He's on a train, but it breaks down in the middle of the desert, and he can't seem to fix it, because he doesn't know how. But he doesn't want to give up, even though everyone else is saying, whatever, don't worry about it. Then, a group of canvas-covered wagons approaches, and one of the people in the caravan explains to Eddie that the bridge across the Mississippi was destroyed, the one destroyed when Project X blew up, and so there's no way to get to New York from where he's at. Everyone leaves with the caravan, but Eddie decides to keep trying to fix the engine, but ultimately fails. Then there's a kind of montage over all the cool utopian capitalist heroes doing their thing at John Galt's Gulch. Ooh, wow, oh, look, all the outside world has reverted back to canvas-covered wagons days, but our utopian capitalist heroes are all awesome and practically living in some kind of utopian future. With the dystopian Bleeding Hearts all dead, presumably, the utopian capitalists amend the Constitution to ensure that the utopian capitalist world can begin. This amendment states, "Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of production and trade." That's a pretty big amendment to the Constitution. Just for fun, let's look at Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which explains the role of Congress in the federal government. Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts, borrow money on the credit of the United States, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes, to coin money, regulate the value thereof. This new amendment would literally make it impossible for Congress to fulfill, its primary functions. How do people take this book seriously again? Anyway, the text ends with John Galt looking over the wasteland and stating,
"The road is cleared,"
said Galt.
"We're returning to the world."
Conclusion. Alright, the part you've been waiting for. How does Atlas Shrugged stack up against Umberto Eco's 14 Features of Fascism? Well, actually, first, I want to explain how pure libertarian capitalism is total unworkable BS. In the book, all the coolest of Ayn Rand's characters smoke. In fact, the people from John Galt's Gulch smoke fancy cigarettes with little dollar signs on them, which Dagny uses to try and track down and solve the mystery of the Destroyer in parts 1 and 2. Yeah, apparently on top of everything else, the little valley of John Galt's Gulch can also grow tobacco, I guess. But why am I bringing this up? Well, if you saw Knowing Better's video on capitalism and libertarianism, you saw that Ayn Rand was a total denier of the dangers of secondhand smoke. And she had to be. Her worldview kinda requires it. You see, she can admit that there's aggression, like stealing from someone or forcing them to do something at gunpoint, because those things are one person intentionally enacting on another. But she can't admit that secondhand smoke unintentionally enacts violence on those around you, because once you admit that, what's next? Admitting that smoke from factory pipes enacts violence? That pollution from Francisco's copper mines enacts violence? That exhaust and slurry from Reardon's metal production enacts violence? The various air and water and sound and other externalities from the Taggart Transcontinental Rail Line? Soon as you admit that these externalities enact violence on the surrounding community, then you have to admit that those impacted by those externalities should have a say in the cost and benefit and operations of those industries. But heck, if you admit that, then you'd have to admit that libertarian capitalism is bunk, and the true solution is some sort of collective worldview based around democracy and communism and anarchism. If you want a more detailed explanation of this, check out my review of For a New Liberty, which is essentially the manifesto of this Ayn Rand-style libertarian capitalist economic system. But with that out of the way, on to Umberto Eco's 14 Features of Fascism. 1. The Cult of Tradition. One has only to look at the syllabus of every fascist movement to find the major traditionalist thinkers. Yeah, both the Nazis and Atlas Shrugged are reactionary worldviews that glorify fictitious accounts of the past. Where Nazis wanted to valorize the warriors of Sparta or ancient Rome or whatever, Ayn Rand seeks to valorize the capitalists of the industrial era, the DuPonts and Rockefellers and Fords. For example, Dagny Taggart valorizes her grandfather Nat Taggart as a hero from a more heroic time, or Francisco d'Anconia wanting to live up to his family name. All the utopian capitalists long for the more capitalistic heroic past. 2. The rejection of modernism. The Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, is seen as the beginning of modern depravity. In this sense, fascism can be defined as irrationalism. Now this might sound contradictory to the text, since the text is all about fetishizing logic and reason and all that. But where the Nazis wanted to reject modernism and return to traditional thought, this text wants to reject postmodernism and return to modernist thought. Remember Dr. Stadler being mad that all the scientists at the State Science Institute were preaching rejection of reason? Remember John Galt's speech where he said,
"Walk into any college classroom, and you'll hear your professors teaching your children that man can be certain of nothing, that his consciousness has no validity whatever."
Remember the various times in the text that Dagny or Jim Taggart's wife complain about modern art being more degenerate than classical art? I mean, this isn't surprising. Ayn Rand's whole theory of objectivism is inconsistent with postmodern thought. Ayn Rand claiming that gold has objective value, that an airplane is objectively more valuable than a bicycle, her grand narratives about the world, these run contrary to postmodern thought. 3. The cult of action for action's sake. Action being beautiful in itself, it must be taken before or without any previous reflection. Thinking is a form of emasculation. This one almost seems to not apply, but that's simply because Ayn Rand did not write sufficient critiques of her ideas in her own book. So there was no need for action without reflection because there was no need for reflection. I mean, remember all the times Francisco or Dagny or John Galt challenged one of the dystopian bleeding hearts and they just crumbled? Let's compare that to real life. Again, if you've seen Knowing Better's video on capitalism and libertarianism, you saw that when Ayn Rand was challenged on her circular logic, her solution wasn't to reflect. No, thinking is a form of emasculation. Instead, she would just say some pithy thing about denying the objectively wrong perspective of the questioner.
A company...
This is what I don't answer.
Well, wait a minute, you haven't heard the question yet.
She's already estimated her position and my work, incidentally, displaying the quality of her brain.
Did you see our show
last year? You want to create an incident?
No.
Pass it up. I don't regard this as a legitimate question.
4. Disagreement is treason. The critical spirit makes distinctions, and to distinguish is a sign of modernism. Remember when Hank Reardon had that internal dialogue after refusing to join the Steel Alliance where he stated, "From the first extortion he had accepted, from the first directive he had obeyed, he had given them cause to believe that reality was a thing to be cheated." Remember Francisco telling Dagny, "Well, you'll struggle to save Taggart Transcontinental. I will be working to destroy it." Because as long as she was working with the world of the dystopian bleeding hearts, she was the enemy. Remember all the talk by John Galt about how they must never compromise with the dystopian bleeding hearts? How they must hold strong with their strike to ensure their destruction? Throughout the text, any compassion, any compromise with the looters is seen as treason. 5. Fear of difference. The first appeal of a fascist or prematurely fascist movement is an appeal against the intruders. This one's easy. All the talk about people being parasites and looters and all that. In fact, let's play a little game. I'm going to read a few quotes of text to you, and you can tell me if you think they're quotes from Atlas Shrugged, referring to the looters, or if they're quotes by Hitler, referring to the Jewish people. Are you ready? Here we go. 1. They are the natural bait for the swarms of blank that stay under rocks for centuries, but come crawling out at the first smell of a man who begs to be forgiven for the guilt of owning wealth. 2. It seems monstrously wrong to surrender the world to the blank, and monstrously wrong to live under their rule. 3. I could say to you that you will and can achieve nothing but universal devastation, as any blank must when he runs out of victims. 4. The slave drivers of those states are kept in power by the handouts from their fellow blank in countries not yet fully drained, such as this country. And 5. We'll fight the blank as long as we can. I don't know what future is possible to us, but we'll win or we'll learn that it's hopeless. Until we do, we'll fight for our world. We're all that's left of it. Okay, what do you think? Which ones were Ayn Rand discussing the looters and which were Hitler discussing Jews? Drum roll, please. Oops, it was a trick. They're all quotes from Atlas Shrugged. 6. Appeal to social frustration. One of the most typical features of the historical fascism was the appeal to a frustrated middle class, a class suffering from an economic crisis or feelings of political humiliation and frightened by the pressure of lower social groups. Oh yeah, I mean that's the whole argument of the book, right? That the capitalists are being held back by the bureaucracy and social spending and regulation that the looters and parasites impose on them. I mean, this was written in part as a response to what Ayn Rand saw as frustration with America's move towards socialism and away from capitalism, that was the New Deal. 7. The obsession with a plot. This is explained when Hank tells Dagny that the dystopian bleeding hearts are only pretending to see the world as they do. And when the homeless man on the train tells Dagny, they didn't do it by any kind of mistake. Mistakes of this size are never made innocently. And it's explained by John Galt in his big speech where he says,
They do not want to succeed. They want you to fail. They do not want to live. They want you to die. They desire nothing. They hate existence.
It's explained that while these dystopian bleeding hearts talk a lot about the social good and social responsibility and all that, what they're actually doing is evil. And they know it's evil. And they're doing it intentionally as part of some love of irrationality and death. Sounds like an international plot to me. 8. The enemy is both strong and weak. By a continuous shifting of rhetorical focus, the enemies are at the same time too strong and too weak. As I said earlier, we see this with Nazi Germany. The Jewish people are both degenerate subhumans that the master race could easily defeat, but they're also super secretly controlling everything behind the scenes. And with our modern neo-Nazis, they talk about SJWs and feminists. They're all deranged soy boys, but they're also controlling video games and Hollywood movies behind the scenes. Mexican immigrants are lazy, but they're also taking everyone's jobs. And the same goes here. The dystopian bleeding hearts are both lazy, uninventive moochers, but they're also controlling the entire political and economic system. 9. Pacifism is trafficking with the enemy. For fascism, there is no struggle for life, but rather life is lived for struggle. Now, because of all the non-aggression principle stuff popular with capitalist libertarian types, there isn't much direct attacking of the dystopian bleeding hearts by the utopian capitalists. Well, not until the end when Dagny and the others go around shooting people left and right. But really, this lack of violence isn't about the non-aggression principle stuff, it more has to do with the fact that this is a made-up story. After setting up all of this us versus them framing, the dystopian bleeding hearts being bad and we should never compromise with them and they must be stopped at all cost, then Ayn Rand can conveniently write a story where the dystopian bleeding hearts all die in train accidents and weapons explosions and even revel in their deaths without the utopian capitalists having to be the murderers themselves. 10. Contempt for the weak. Elitism is a typical aspect of any reactionary ideology. Calling people looters and parasites. Check. 11. Everybody is educated to become a hero. In fascist ideology, heroism is the norm. Now, as I said in number 1, in Atlas Shrugged, folks aren't trained to be heroes in the Spartan warrior sense, But from the glorification of Grandpappy Nat Taggart to the celebration of industrialists like Hank Rearden and Francisco d'Anconia and John Galt, it certainly seems to be that the people in the book, and the people reading the book, should strive to be like these heroic industrialist, selfish ubermenches. 12. Machismo and weaponry. Machismo implies both disdain for women and intolerance and condemnation for non-standard sexual habits, from chastity to homosexuality. Weaponry? No, not really. In the text, that's more of a government thing, with the Project X and all that. Although real-life ANCAPs and capitalist libertarians do certainly fetishize weaponry. Non-standard sexual habits and chastity and homophobia don't really seem to be here either. However, in the book, most of the women are dystopian bleeding hearts. And in this book and her other works, Ayn Rand really goes for the playing hard to get, no means yes, Dagny wants to be reduced to an object for Hank or Galt's desire stuff, so there does seem to be quite a bit of misogyny in Ayn Rand's work. There are a few articles about this, so check those out if you want to know more. 13. Selective populism. There is in our future a TV or internet populism in which the emotional response of a selected group of citizens can be presented and accepted as the voice of the people. In the real world, we see this with neo-Nazi folks claiming to speak for real Americans and the silent majority regarding feminism, immigration, Black Lives Matter, or whatever. And in this story, the citizens all supposedly distrust Rearden Metal and dislike Hank and Dagny, but they're also flooding the streets and rooftops cheering them on. The story seems to jump back and forth between the people hating the utopian capitalists and loving them. We see in John Galt's speech that you are either part of the selected utopian capitalists who know how things really are, or you're a looter parasite. This is certainly selective populism. And finally, 14. Fascism speaks newspeak. All the Nazi or fascist school books made use of an impoverished vocabulary, an elementary syntax, in order to limit the instruments for complex and critical reasoning. I think Ayn Rand would argue that her work does not engage in newspeak, in the limiting of complex or critical reasoning. I think she would argue that, although this story is a little hyperbolic, it is a thoughtful and nuanced explanation of capitalism and its relationship to bureaucracy. But, as we've seen going over the text, this is not the case. The great man theory style promotion of industrialists, the joy that's taken in letting the so-called looters and parasites wallow in their despair or die tragically, the us versus them talk, the conspiracy about the plot to destroy the world, anyone remotely familiar with economics or politics should find this story laughably reductive. This book is an incredibly naive and dogmatic take on the struggle between capitalism and the government, which will give readers a limited understanding of the complexity or critical reasoning required to properly understand these issues. So, short story long, the stuff about college professors teaching the next generation to deny reason, the stuff about modern art and music being degenerate, the stuff about a looter class with unjustified political power holding back the prime mover capitalists and giving unjust money and resources to the parasites, thus causing degeneracy in the economy and the government and the world, all the times the story revels in the deaths of people it calls looters and parasites. If you just switch the term prime mover for master race, switch the term looter for Jews, and switch the term parasite for degenerate, you can clearly see Atlas Shrugged is fascist propaganda. Now, if you're a fan of Ayn Rand, a fan of Atlas Shrugged, I assume you were able to get this far in the video. I mean, it is only like 1/50th the length of the Atlas Shrugged audiobook. Well, if you are such a person, you might be thinking, hey, wait a minute, Atlas Shrugged isn't fascist. Ayn Rand was a devout anti-fascist. She wrote letters and gave speeches all about it. Checkmate, you statist commie. But, no. I think Ayn Rand misunderstands fascism so much that she was able to claim to be anti-fascist while writing fascist propaganda. I mean, the letters, these speeches, that ain't it, Chief. She makes the stupidest arguments in them. In one of them, she literally makes the, actually, Nazi stood for National Socialist. See, it has socialist right in the name. She makes that argument.
Let me remind you that the full title of the Nazi Party was the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany.
Then she goes on this Nazis and liberals are the same argument, which kind of reminds me of the book Liberal Fascism. I might review that book one of these days. These are hilarious arguments, like liberals and fascists are the same because, look, they both do marches, they both shout slogans. Hitler and FDR both encouraged patriotism and promoted their constituents that they would make the country better. But yeah, all politicians do that. Conservatives preach the patriotism of law and order and cutting taxes and traditional family values. and liberals preach the patriotism of racial justice and LGBT plus rights and environmentalism. I guess this is the kind of analysis you get when you consider all government action to be theft and murder and tyranny and torture without any nuance of the goals or structure of the government in question. Also, in Ayn Rand's letter on fascism, she argues that fascism is just the big business version of socialism. But wait, didn't John Galt and all his industrialist friends literally rewrite the Constitution to codify their worldview into law? Kinda sounds like we're on the same page here, Ayn Rand. Turns out maybe we both think that Atlas Shrugged is fascist. So, anyway, yeah, capitalist libertarianism is a BS ideology and Atlas Shrugged is fascist propaganda. If you're going to read a classic political philosophy novel, you should probably just read something like Iron Heel by Jack London or The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin. Anyway, as always, I'd like to thank my wonderful patrons for objectively determining that it is in their rational self-interest to support this channel and help me purchase dog food and books and toys and dog insurance and things like that, and for allowing me to support other creators I couldn't otherwise support. I appreciate you folks a lot. And if you like what I do here and you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/radicalreviewer. And if you're interested in radical theory, looking for a book recommendation or whatever, you can get your radical reviews here with the Radical Reviewer. Thanks for watching.
And I have no respect for those with no respect for logic. You're a very stupid person.